In every spiritual journey, we often imagine our relationship with God as something filled with peace, joy, and light. However, hidden beneath all of that is a more mysterious and challenging phase, the dark night of the soul. It's not merely a moment of crisis or ordinary suffering, but a profound spiritual stage where God seems to conceal himself from us. Yet, this is not a rejection or punishment, it is a process of purification, necessary to prepare the soul for full union with God. This concept, articulated by St. John of the Cross, has guided many who walk the serious spiritual path. But what exactly happens during the dark night of the soul, and why is this journey so painful yet essential? It all begins when a person who has long strived to draw closer to God suddenly feels a dramatic shift in their spiritual life. Those who once enjoyed the sweetness of joy in prayer and God's presence are confronted by an intense inner emptiness. Prayers that once brought peace now feel hollow, as if the words no longer reach God. This is not just a small test of faith, but a profound crisis that shakes the soul. Often, those experiencing the dark night of the soul wonder what went wrong. They might ask, has God abandoned me? Did I commit a sin that made him withdraw? But, as St. John of the Cross explains, this is not a sign of God's rejection. Rather, it is the opposite, it is a sign that God is purifying the soul from all illusions and worldly attachments. This is an invitation to enter a deeper relationship, where God removes earthly comforts so that the soul may fully rely on faith, not on emotions or feelings. One of the clearest signs of the dark night of the soul is a feeling of dryness in prayer. For many who walk the path of faith, prayer is a source of comfort, a moment when they feel God's presence so close. But during the dark night of the soul, prayer suddenly becomes a routine devoid of meaning, no longer bringing peace or joy. It is a time when the soul feels that every prayer no longer reaches God's ears. Why does this happen? According to St. John of the Cross, God deliberately withdraws this spiritual comfort to teach the soul to love him not for the gifts or consolations he gives, but for himself. At this point, the soul is called to enter a purer faith, where God's presence is no longer dependent on external signs or emotional experiences. Many people experiencing this dryness feel trapped in a meaningless routine. Prayer, meditation, and sacraments that once brought peace now seem futile. But this is part of the purification. God is teaching the soul to remain faithful in prayer, even when no consolation is felt. This is true faith. Faith that does not rely on feelings, but on a deep conviction that God remains present even when the soul cannot sense him. Along with dryness in prayer, the soul often experiences a deeply unsettling crisis of faith. When God feels distant, the soul begins to doubt everything it once believed. Painful questions arise. Does God really exist? If he does, why do I feel so far away from him? This crisis can be profoundly disturbing, especially for those who have long walked in strong faith. Yet, this is where faith is tested and purified. St. John of the Cross explains that this crisis is an essential part of the purification process. True faith is faith that can endure darkness without depending on emotions or external experiences. In the dark night of the soul, faith is tested to its core, forcing the soul to trust in God even when he seems invisible. This process is not punishment. Instead, God uses this darkness to purify the soul of any spiritual pride or attachments that still block true union with him. The faith that emerges from this crisis is far stronger because it is no longer based on emotional experience, but on a deep conviction of God's love that surpasses all understanding. At its heart, the dark night of the soul is about purifying the soul from all worldly attachments and the ego. Many people think that the closer one is to God, the more consolation they receive. However, the truth is that the closer one is to God, the greater the demand for the soul to release all attachments that hinder true union with him. In the spiritual life, the soul may unknowingly still cling to worldly things, or even to its own ego. There may be subtle pride in spiritual achievements, the feeling that one has attained a higher level in their spiritual journey. However, St. John of the Cross explains that this spiritual pride is the greatest barrier to true union with God. In the dark night of the soul, God purifies the soul from all forms of ego and pride in the most painful way, by making the soul feel insignificant. When the soul feels it has lost everything, including the feeling of closeness to God, this is the moment when it begins to realize that all goodness comes from God, not from human effort or achievement. At this point, the soul is called to release all desires and control, and to learn to surrender everything to God. This is the deepest purification, because only by completely letting go of all attachments can the soul unite with God in the purest and truest way. One of the greatest lessons of the dark night of the soul is the importance of perseverance. When all consolation is gone and prayer feels pointless, the soul is called to endure. This is the greatest test of faith. Can the soul remain faithful to God even when there are no signs of His presence? St. John of the Cross teaches that in the dark night of the soul, God is working behind the scenes, even though the soul cannot feel it. This perseverance is not a form of defeat, but a true victory. The soul that remains steadfast in darkness is learning that God's love does not depend on rewards or consolation, but on total surrender to His will. This is the purest form of love, where the soul loves God not for what He gives, but for who He is. During this phase, the soul is also called to relinquish all control. In the depths of darkness, the soul learns that everything that happens is part of God's greater plan. This surrender is not a form of defeat, but a true victory, where the soul learns to trust everything to God. Though the journey through the dark night of the soul may seem long and filled with suffering, there is a promise that awaits at the end. After passing through this darkness, the soul will experience a deeper union with God. This union transcends all human experiences, for the soul has been prepared to receive God's love that surpasses all understanding. The soul that has passed through the dark night of the soul no longer seeks worldly or even spiritual consolation. They have learned to love God with all their hearts, without condition. The peace they feel is not the peace that comes from feelings or emotional experiences, but the peace that comes from true union with God. This transformation brings the soul to a deeper spiritual maturity, where they are no longer swayed by external or emotional circumstances. They live in a profound peace that is unshakable by anything that happens around them. Ultimately, the dark night of the soul is a profound gift from God. Though it is filled with suffering and darkness, it is a necessary purification process for those who seek full union with God. In this darkness, God purifies the soul from all worldly attachments, ego, and spiritual pride, allowing the soul to love Him with all its heart. When all consolation is gone and prayer feels pointless, remember that God is working in His own way, preparing us for a more perfect union with Him. In this darkness, the soul is prepared to receive God's love more deeply, a love that surpasses all human experience and understanding. May God bless you.